Hey everyone, today's video is all about bow fishing for snakeheads.
There he is. He's in. Get him, get him, get him, get him, get him.
I've been chasing snakeheads all spring and summer with rod and reel and with a bow, and they've quickly become my favorite fish to target. And here's why. I mean, they're big fish. Average fish is 3 to 6 pounds. The world record is 10 pounds. It's not uncommon to see one, 10 to 15 pounds. So they're, a large fish that lives in really cool areas. They kind of look behind me. You can see I'm in a marshy type area. Not the typical place that you would go to go fishing or bow fishing, but it's really cool to get out into these massive lily pad fields and chase these fish. They're also really delicious. My favorite freshwater fish to eat is a snakehead now. The meat is white, firm, very mild, no fishy taste. I would say the flavor is similar to maybe a crappie, and then the texture is like a tuna or swordfish. It's a very meaty type texture to the meat. So it's really good in a lot of different recipes. It's very versatile because it's so mild. It'll take on the flavors of whatever seasoning you want to put it in. Of course, it's good fried, baked, broiled, however you want to do it, it's gonna be good. Okay, so how do you go about bow fishing for them? First thing you want to know is, where do you go? What are the spots? How do you find a good bow fishing spot for snakeheads? Well, if you just search, snakehead map, it'll show you all these little dots on all the areas where snakeheads exist. To make it easier on you, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all have northern snakeheads. The bullseyes are in Florida, and then there's more speckled throughout the country. The Mississippi has a small population, but it could be a cool thing to do in a couple years. Once you found a river system that has snakeheads, what you want to look for are the creeks that feed into that river. So let's say, for example, the Potomac River. Everyone knows the Potomac has snakeheads. They've been there for about 20 years. And all the creeks that feed into the Potomac are going to have snakeheads. Some of them are better than others. What you're looking for is vegetation. So lily pads, grass, spatterdock, milfoil, hydrilla, that type of stuff. Snakeheads really like to hide in the grass, or hide in vegetation. They also really like shallow water. They like places with low current. And they like warm water. And they can live in shallow warm water because they breathe air. So they have lungs like some other fish, so they actually gulp air to survive. So they can live in some pretty harsh environments that other fish can't. If you're already bow fishing for carp or gar or something else, that equipment is going to work just fine for bow fishing for snakeheads. One modification I would suggest for snakeheads, that goes beyond just your standard bow fishing bow and arrow, is to upgrade your point. These are big fish, and they fight really hard after you hit them, and they have a tendency to pull that arrow out, if you're not using an arrow with a good barb. So think about upgrading your point to one that has a bigger barb on it. Okay, now let's discuss bow fishing strategy. It's a lot about covering water when you're bow fishing for snakeheads. Now, you can bow fish for them during the day, but you're gonna have to be a little bit more stealthy than you would at night. During the day, these fish are a little bit more spooky. So if you're running an engine, think about just using like a trolling motor or even just a push pull to get around. If you're in a kayak, stand up, paddle real slow, be very cautious about dropping things in the bottom of your boat or your kayak. Those little things can make a big difference in terms of spotting these fish. The other thing that you're going to need is clear water. If the water is stained or tannic, you're not going to be able to see these fish, so clear water is very important. Another thing to keep in mind is places like the Potomac River are tidal. So, like I said earlier, snakeheads like to hide back in the vegetation, but we can use the tides to our advantage. When we have a low tide, it forces these fish out of those thick lily pad fields and into areas where we can see them easier. So fishing, the 2 hours before, 2 hours after a low tide is going to typically be your best bet, although high tides can be good in some areas. So you're going to have to just experiment, but to start off with, I would say a low tide is a good bet. If you're serious about bow fishing for snakeheads, nighttime is where it's at. You know, if you have a boat with lights, or you can rig up some lights in your kayak, that's the way to do it if you're going to be serious about it, you really want to get into it. So at night, you have the lights. It's really cool. You get to see a lot of fish, other than snakeheads. And that's another cool thing about bow fishing for snakeheads is there are opportunities to shoot other fish. One of my favorites is blue cats. So they're another invasive species, and they taste really good too. So especially the smaller ones, but blue cats get really big. So that's awesome to shoot a giant blue cat. You'll also see gar and carp, maybe even a goldfish. So some interesting options besides snakeheads out there. As I mentioned earlier, snakeheads are really delicious to eat. Now there's nothing special you need to worry about in terms of cooking them, but filleting them is standard. If you fillet a fish, you can fillet a snakehead. One thing to keep in mind though is they're really a slimy fish. They have a lot of slime coat on them, and that can make it difficult to fillet them on a normal cutting board. So what I like to do is I like to fillet them on top of cardboard or newspaper just to help them from sliding around a lot. Snakehead might be one of the most difficult fish to handle because they fight really hard when you hit them initially, and then when you get them in the boat, they lull you into a false sense of security. And then all of a sudden they'll come back to life, they'll flop around like crazy, and they're very slimy, so it's easy to lose control of one. Another thing to keep in mind is they have teeth. So when you're handling snakeheads, you want to use lip grippers or a pair of pliers to grip the inside of their mouths. Lip grippers work really well. They clamp on to that bottom jaw, and then that fish isn't going anywhere as long as you hold on to your lip grippers. Obviously there's no catch and release in bow fishing, so once you get your fish in the boat, you have it under control, you're going to want to dispatch that fish right away. And that's something that most states mandate, is that you can't move from the position that you just caught that fish. You need to kill it immediately, and that's just because they don't want people moving these fish around. So they want them, if they're on your boat, they need to be dead. So my favorite way to dispatch a snakehead is to cut their gills. It bleeds them out, which makes your meat less bloody, and it's a really effective way. Just make sure you cut both gills very thoroughly. These are really tough fish. You can bludgeon them, you can cut off their head, however you want to do it. Just make sure the job is done, and then get them on ice right away to keep your meat really good. I hope this video was helpful in getting you started bow fishing for snakeheads. I want to say a special thank you to Bill and Colin who took me out bow fishing. We wouldn't have all this cool action footage if it weren't for them. So thank you to those guys. And if you're interested in getting started, I highly suggest it. We'll see you all in the next video.